All right. Hi, everyone. We've got a few more people joining, I see, but we're a couple minutes after the hour and want to squeeze in as much as we can to the hour. So we will kick things off. This is Bettina Bergu speaking. I'm from the Natural Resources Defense Council, which is one of the lead partners of the Energy Efficiency for All initiative, a collaborative to improve efficiency in multifamily affordable housing. So today we are going to be talking about understanding, valuing, and financing climate resilience in multifamily affordable housing. And let's see here, the host of today's call is the Sustainability in Affordable Housing Lender Learning Network, which was started as part of EFA, the mission of which is to leverage the collective expertise of folks such as yourself, people with expertise in financing specifically, to forward this goal of improving efficiency of multifamily affordable housing across the country. So we do have a website. We have a resource hub with some resources that we've compiled and some of which we've created, such as recordings of webinars we've had in the past. So welcome everyone to go visit that website and even contribute resources that you have that you think might be a good fit for that resource hub. You can see the advisory group there listed at the bottom, folks who were part of launching this network that we call SALN about a year and a half ago. So today we are not just having a webinar, we'll share information, but we're actually having what we're calling a lender learning call. So more of a conversation. We're going to be talking about how multifamily housing lenders and partners can identify and finance mitigation of climate risks in housing properties. So to get us started, we are going to hear some scene setting remarks from folks who have been thinking about this topic and have been doing things on this topic. They're going to answer questions such as, how are buildings and residents subject to climate risks? What can be done in multifamily housing properties to make them more climate resilient, both pre-disaster as well as post-disaster? What does that look like? And importantly, how can increased climate resilience be valued? And how can we use that valuation to actually finance projects? So after we hear from our call leaders on their perspective on those questions based on their experience, we're actually going to open the line up to anyone who is also thinking about these topics or just has general questions on them. So we will be sure to leave plenty of time, not just for kind of Q&A, but just for discussion. So I'll get to some housekeeping as to how we're going to do that, but I do want to mention who our call leaders are, folks who, as I mentioned, are really on the vanguard of thinking about these issues. We have Esther Toporowski, the Senior Program Director of Green Communities at Enterprise Community Partners, and also Lori Schumann, the Senior Program Director of Resilient Communities and Disaster Recovery, also at Enterprise. And for those of you who are not familiar, Enterprise is a nonprofit that finances, builds, and also advocates for affordable housing. We also have Tom Chase with us. He's the Senior Project Manager at New Ecology, Inc., which is a nonprofit that is also seeking to address global environmental and equity issues by making the built environment more efficient, healthy, durable, and resilient. So clearly people who are thinking about resilience. We're going to hear from them in a moment, but as I mentioned, we are going to welcome you to answer or to put questions into the question box in your GoToWebinar control panel if you have them. And I'm happy to voice those questions after the panelists have spoken. But we'll also welcome you to raise your hand. If you raise your hand, in your control panel there, let me know if you don't see it, but there's an arrow on your screen showing you where that hand button should be. If you raise your hand, then I'll be notified of that, and then I can click on your hand to unmute my end. And then importantly, you have to unmute yourself by also clicking on your little audio button. So hoping that we can make this work. It's the first time, but we will see. And I'll give you a reminder of how to do this after Lori, Esther, and Tom speak as well. And also, again, you can put your questions in the questions box if you prefer. And we are recording this conversation so that others who weren't able to join can also benefit from it. And that being said, send me a chat in the chat box if you have any questions, but I will send it off to, I think, Lori and Esther to kick us off.
Thanks so much, Bettina. This is Lori Schumann of Enterprise.
Hey, and Esther Toporowski with Enterprise as well.
And we're really excited for the opportunity to share with you some of our thinking about what we think about how resilience is defined for the multifamily housing sector, and then some resources we've identified to help support the implementation and deployment of resilient infrastructure. And I'll just say by starting, we're very much at the early stages of this kind of thinking, as all of us are. So we really look forward to a healthy conversation at the end of the webinar about what you're also uncovering. So let's begin with the journey. Enterprise Community Partners, if you can just go to the next slide, Bettina. Enterprise Community Partners is a national housing organization, an intermediary that's been around for about 35 years. The best way I like to define Enterprise is we create opportunity around the country for low and moderate income communities by creating healthy and resilient housing, by promoting progressive policies that support our communities, by innovating catalytic tools and programs that support the sustainability of our communities. What we are facing more and more as a nation is the incredible risk that many of our communities are facing around climate. Across the nation, we're seeing that the tragedies that have befallen Houston and New Orleans and New York City after the events, flooding events, are subjecting so many communities to similar consequences, and we're seeing more and more how extreme these events are calling us into action. I will share that there was an article in the New York Times that came out yesterday about Paradise, California, and how many homeowners have been displaced and are now homeless as a result of the devastating fires in Paradise and Northern California. So for us, Bettina, please go to the next slide. For us, building affordable housing that's sustainable and resilient is very much about preserving our housing stock from the risks that we're facing. We are very conscious of the fact, because we've been working in this space for 35 years, how difficult it is to build, to design, to develop, to deploy, and maintain an affordable housing site. Many of you that are on this call truly understand how much effort it takes to stand up an affordable housing facility. We know that one storm, one earthquake, one fire could undo decades of work. So we really are committed to getting ahead of this challenge by identifying how to build resilient infrastructure. Bettina, next slide, please. I'm showing an article from Houston after the Hurricane Harvey happened, and that was 2016. Well, it's almost been 2 years since that event, and many of these communities have still not come back to their homes. We've been on the ground with many of the communities in Houston and in Harris County trying to figure out what does it take to rebuild this infrastructure and how are we going to pay for it. So the heart of our conversation today is what is it and how are we going to pay for it. Bettina, next slide, please. And so, as I mentioned, we are focusing on recovering communities both before, after an event, and also thinking about how to build communities that are going to be stronger in the face of an event. Bettina, next slide. We work all over the country providing technical assistance, policy support, and innovating some solutions with communities across the country, working closely in communities in the Gulf, in the Caribbean, West Coast, East Coast, and more in the central region. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what kind of projects we've been working on. To give you a sense, we do work across the board with many of the divisions within Enterprise, and so we have a lot of capacity and a deep bench of understanding of how to build housing and how to preserve it. Bettina, next slide, please. And one of the pillars of our work is promoting policy that's progressive and is going to support our housing community. So when we think about funding and financing, a lot of the financing and funding is actually unlocked by the policies that we put into place. So community development block grant funding, which is a major resource for rebuilding communities, is the major resource for rebuilding communities after a disaster. We've just gone to the Hill. My colleague, Mary McFadden, testified before the Senate Banking Committee and said we need to have a standing line of CDBG-DR funding, and what that'll allow us to do is have some more security that there is a base funding source in place for recovery. So unlocking funding through policy that's innovative and progressive is an important part of our work. Bettina, please, next slide. And providing long-term disaster and recovery, which I'll talk about in a minute, through our markets. We have 11 markets around the country where we have staff and communities that we've built, and so we work with our markets. We also work across the board. Esther and I sit on the national team, and we support communities around the country through our national arm, and again through our policy. And we also have a division called Enterprise Advisors that actually gets deployed after an event to support community rebuilding and recovery. Bettina, next slide. So that was just a little bit about Enterprise and what we bring to bear in this space. And I will mention, I actually came into Enterprise after the Superstorm Sandy program to run our work in New York City, New Jersey. And that was my first foray into the work we're doing for Enterprise. But I actually started out working for the Archdiocese of New York with Catholic Charities about 20 years ago, running an emergency feeding and shelter network for the Archdiocese. And so my first step into this space was through the lens of dealing with the emergency that was called poverty at the time. I mention this because it's important when we look at who we're serving in this space. A lot of who we're serving are vulnerable communities that are one paycheck away from being homeless. One storm can push a community, a household over the edge, and we're seeing this in Paradise. We're seeing this played out in Houston. We're seeing this played out in Puerto Rico, that the most vulnerable among us are going to take longer time to recover, if they ever do recover at all. So last week, the National Climate Assessment came out, and this is a foundational report that the White House released. And this basically was an effort that was started by the Reagan administration to understand what the nation's climate risk actually is. This is the leading and most foundational report on climate change, and this is the resource you need to pay attention to because it's brought together the best and brightest minds in our country around climate science. And here's what they said to us on the first page of the report. I extracted this so you can all understand how eminently important providing financial resources and supporting resilient communities is within the affordable housing sector. People who are already vulnerable, including lower income and marginalized communities, have lower capacity to prepare for and cope with extreme weather and climate-related events, are expected to experience greater impacts. Bettina, next slide. What that means is, Bettina, please go back. What this means is the communities that we're serving through our affordable housing services are the communities we need to be thinking about as our priority for support, because these are the communities that don't have insurance, that don't have reserve, that don't have support, and if our affordable housing facility goes dark, literally, they won't have anywhere to go. And so one of our challenges is trying to figure out how to actually finance the ability to upgrade and update these facilities so that they are more able to sustain risk. Bettina, next slide. And our commitment to our communities is that all affordable housing across the nation is designed, constructed, and operated to mitigate and adapt to the risks of severe weather and natural hazards. Bettina, next slide. And so the way we think about our work in this space is in two buckets. We think about the work we're doing with communities before a disaster occurs, and then the work we're doing with communities after a disaster. Now, clearly, when you're coming into a community before a disaster occurs, that's the best case scenario, because that's a time when you have this time to plan and you have the ability to build on what you've already got in place. When you come in after a disaster, it's a whole different scenario. You've got triage to think about. People are in crisis. So in the pre-disaster space, we're looking at how do we mitigate impacts and protect the communities before an event. And so all of the solutions that we've identified to help do this come in before the disaster occurs. And then post-disaster, we're thinking about what kind of guidance do we have to provide to agencies and entities to help them rebuild with resilience in mind. Bettina, next slide. We're working across the country, as I mentioned, in a variety of ways. I want to just tell you about a couple of projects that we will relate to later in the webinar, but that are important to think about when you think about what does it mean to finance resilience. So Esther and I have been working with our Los Angeles market to think about setting up a fund to support the seismic mitigation for Los Angeles's soft story buildings. We're working with the City of LA and with the Federal Reserve on this, and this is an opportunity to build out some tools to finance this work. In Sonoma, we set up a fund to help support recovery of housing in Sonoma, and through our brickwork, we have deployed over $1 million to developers in Sonoma to help them with their affordable housing reconstruction. We're thinking about how do we support the larger efforts in Northern California based on this initial work. In Puerto Rico, we're working with communities to identify what does resilient housing look like? What are the qualifications of resilient housing? And we're actually building a guide, about 100 partners around Puerto Rico, to define what this looks like. And then there's a lot of other work we're doing around the country to think about how do you define resilience and then how do you implement it. Bettina, next slide, please. So, financing resilience. How do we finance the work? How do we support the implementation and deployment of this infrastructure? So as I mentioned, we've got two buckets we're looking at, pre-disaster and post-disaster. And each particular bucket has a set of resources associated with it. As I mentioned, in the pre-disaster space, you have time to plan, you have time to think about what you want to do without the crisis of triage in front of you. And so this is the time where you can establish infrastructure that allows you to establish an ROI that will potentially help pay for the infrastructure to be built. This is infrastructure related to efficiency and utility conservation. You're also looking at how do you secure the investment and asset so that you're able to stave off an emergency event. In the post-disaster, there's a lot of uncertainty around recovery. Nobody knows exactly when funding is coming in. And there's also a lot of uncertainty about the capacity for a housing organization to actually rebuild. We have partners in Northern California right now where their headquarters have been burned down. What is their capacity to actually rebuild their homes? Bettina, next slide, please. And so what does pre- and post-disaster resilience infrastructure look like? And we do a lot of training on this. What is the qualities and components of infrastructure that's resilient? And we have produced a book called the Strategies for Multifamily Housing Resilience, which will circulate after this event, to show you exactly some of the specific interventions that we were thinking about. Pre-disaster mitigation is very much related to protecting your building before an event. You're looking at elevating buildings for the multifamily housing stock. That's not actually always feasible, but elevating critical equipment is. And we're going to talk in a second about a case study that will relate what we've done in New York City on one building. You're looking at flood walls. You're looking at perimeter flood proofing, gray infrastructure, pipe solutions. You're looking at energy efficiency and reducing your load for the building so that when you actually do bring in your backup systems, you're not backing up an inefficient building. And then post-disaster, a couple of strategies that we've been thinking about is identifying ways of incorporating more ventilation into buildings, daylighting the buildings, figuring out how to back up your systems. And so there's an opportunity after post-disaster to actually plan forward and build resilience within the facility. But we need to have the right specifications and guidelines available so that we can do that. and I have a slide that shows dinosaurs, and we were joking, why are we showing dinosaurs on this slide? Well, if you look around the global market, a lot of our partners in this space in other countries are way ahead of us in terms of identifying resilient solutions. And so the United States has a long way to go to keep up with our colleagues in Germany, our colleagues in the UK, even in parts of Asia that have really been taking the lead on doing a lot of this infrastructure work. Bettina, next slide. And much of it actually funded by the World Bank, which is they're doing a great job through their GFDRR unit. Examples of some resilient infrastructure. This is an example of an infrastructure assembly that came in the Bronx. It's Jonathan Rose's Via Verde project. It's a beautiful project that highlights a lot of the stormwater management infrastructure and LID that can be brought into a project to mitigate precipitation-related flooding. Next slide. This is a project in Lower East Side, a 150-year-old tenement that was flooded after Superstorm Sandy, and they worked with the local New York City Housing and Preservation Development Department with the CDBG-DR as a source of funding to elevate their boiler from the basement to the roof. This is a headline for a New York Times article that came out a couple months ago about this assembly. For about $300,000, they were able to move their mechanicals from the basement to the roof. They were able to reduce their heating load for the building. They were able to increase their efficiency and save money over time. They also, the same building, took their sub-meters for their energy utility that were buried in the basement, and they condensed them to 1 meter and moved the meter above the base flood elevation of the building, and so those are safe now from flooding. Next slide, please. And so again, we have some guidance that we can share with you after on what it looks like to actually think about building a resilient manner. Next slide. So, couple points I'd like to make on how to build a resilience project, make it work for the low and moderate income community. So first, you want to think about what is the problem you're solving for? What is the hazard that your community is facing? Is it flooding, earthquake, heat? What are the parameters of that risk as a primary risk? And then you want to think about, well, what is that risk? What are the consequences of that risk? So in the climate mitigation world, we say this in terms of what's your primary risk, then what does that lead to? So that would be your secondary risk. And then what's your tertiary risk, which is the ultimate outcome of what would happen if, for example, power loss occurred. So clarify the problem. Then you want to think about what kind of financing do you have available as an owner for your facility improvement. And you're also going to want to think about at what point are you going to be instituting an improvement? When are you thinking about your capital planning? Tom and I talk to owners a lot about when the opportunity is to make an improvement. So when you're thinking about your financing, you're also going to want to think about at what point is the owner going in for a capital retrofit. Oftentimes in New York, when we're moving out of the 15-year compliance period, there's a funding source that the city gives owners, and at that point, that's a good point to think about what kind of improvements you want to bring in. Next, you want to think about diversifying your financing. So what are you going to do to integrate your resilience measures into other types of projects to make it work? So how do you co-locate your resilience project with another capital improvement you're making? So for example, in the case of a New York project, if you're moving your boiler, if you're converting your boiler to a more efficient unit, what would it look like to convert it to a condensing unit and then move it above the base flood elevation? So how do you co-locate and relate the resilience lens to all the capital work you're doing, particularly if you're in a floodplain? Because if you're in a floodplain, this is something that's more and more becoming really part of what you need to be incorporating into your planning. Value the co-benefits. So every resilience improvement that we like to cite has a series of co-benefits. If you have the opportunity to build a berm, for example, around your facility, what is the opportunity to make that into a recreational area that can support social resilience? Or if you have the opportunity, for example, to incorporate active ventilation into your facility, the co-benefit of that is certainly going to be increased health. We've seen it and we've studied it. And so those co-benefits are what we can actually start to value, and it's actually something that I'm looking forward to hearing from all of you today in the conversation. How do you actually value co-benefits? And this is something of immediate concern for us as you think about financing an improvement, a resiliency improvement. Then you want to think about your champions and your partners. We like to partner with our municipal and jurisdictional partners because they can provide both a carrot and stick when it comes to instituting these measures. In Los Angeles, we've worked closely with the mayor's office because they have a mandate actually out that states that owners of soft storage have to rebuild, have to retrofit their facilities for seismic resilience. Well, that's a key champion. So really working with your public sector partners is really critical, and they can help you facilitate larger resiliency projects. When you're looking at developing resilience projects, you're always going to want to look at what's happening around your community, particularly around the utilities, transportation, and communications. So what can you do to match up and relate to the larger efforts happening in your community? And if you're a community that's a floodplain community, you can be sure there is work happening at the city level, if not at the state level. Bettina, next slide. There are sources out there for capital work, and we've been looking at them closely to say what sources could be available to help us structure some financing for our resilience investments or resilience improvements. And so there's federal grants. Two of the premier federal resources for pre-disaster support are the Pre-Disaster Mitigation Program and the Hazard Grant Mitigation Program through FEMA. These are programs that are available every year, and they actually are run through the state. So you have to work with your state, your city, to then work with your state partner on the application. But these are really important programs, and there's been increased allocations through Congress for them. Then we've got DR programs and block grant funding that all communities receive. So every community in the country receives some kind of block grant funding. So that's the source. State grants around a variety of utilities. You've got the potential to issue bonds. So Miami just issued a bond on their housing work. There's potential to build in some resiliency work, particularly for the communities that are really vulnerable. There's a lot of discussion around moving some resiliency interventions into bonds, revenues, development impact fees, a lot of work that's happened in the stormwater community around development impact fees. We ask owners to look at utility incentives and programs, everything from energy to water. The Weatherization Assistance Program is an excellent program that actually deploys lots of resiliency-related interventions, and so that's important to think about. And then, of course, the private sector is an important partner in all of this work. Right now, the public sector, i.e. FEMA and HUD, have been thinking about how to leverage the public funding coming into communities for mitigation to secure some private funding through the philanthropic world. Next slide. And essentially, all of this funding is each funding source has a different set of compliance and a different process by which you actually leverage the funding and administer it. And that's important to understand when you think about setting up an investment vehicle. How do you relate to the other sources out there? We would love to see at some point a more unified compliance methodology so that an owner going in for one funding source through FEMA can actually relate their application to HUD to a funding source through another agency. A lot of this money is complicated to spend. Again, largest chunk of resiliency funding explicitly is from the federal coffers, and it is administered through states. And there are cases where there are cities, there's tension between city and state agencies, and so that means the city doesn't always get its fair share of the commitment. So this is something to think about in the policy space. A lot of the funding is disaggregated, and so you've got lots of different funding sources, even within an own agency that is not consolidated. The set aside for low and moderate income communities is minimal. It needs to be increased because if we're not funding the community resilience in the front end, at the back end, after an event occurs, taxpayers are going to be paying for the recovery, and that's going to be a lot more expensive than the actual improvements to their facilities. And then the repayment is hard to define sometimes, especially after an event when a housing owner may be struggling to survive, and they have no reserve. Where can they keep a repayment source and define what that is? And so for all of these reasons, we need to be thinking about some potential solutions. And so I'd like to turn over to Esther to talk us through some of those.
Yeah, I'll just talk really quickly. So I think Lori just kind of outlined, what we've been doing in this space, and I think all the things you have to think about around resilience. And, a lot of it is sort of early day conversations that we start to think about around energy efficiency and even renewable energy. So how do you start to think about kind of catalyzing this market a bit more? And Enterprise is pretty dedicated to looking at all the levers that it actually takes to go there. So there's never going to be a one-size-fits-all solution. There's never going to be a silver bullet. But you have to think about things in sort of buckets. And, we talk about resilience financing. What it really is program. What it really is policy. What it really is sort of leveraging public and private dollars. And so how do you do that in communities? And so we're starting to look at this in sort of 4 boxes. So building readiness for our partners on the ground is pretty key. And so Lori mentioned a lot of the tools and things that we've developed to be able to do that. So how do you sort of build that readiness through policy and programs that work specific to low and moderate income communities, which is unique in this sector. And a lot of it has to do with capacity building and also looking at the return on investment for each measure. So when we start to look at mitigation, how do we start to sort of build a cadre of how do you start to look at and quantify the returns for some of these measures, frankly, that don't fit within really easy repayment source buckets? And how do you start to build sort of bankable projects and programs? And then we start to look at deploying the right capital for low moderate income. How do you package and leverage, again, loans, grants, equity, and that capacity support to make sure that it's not just looking at a product, but that it's also looking at how do you think about pre-development capacity to support a lot of these folks on the ground that need it? And how do you mobilize more resources dedicated to low and moderate income so we avoid, again, the fragmentation, which I think has been a long-standing conversation where you have a ton of money coming in, whether it's pre-disaster or post-disaster, coming in through different agencies and different requirements and different timing. When you're thinking about low and moderate income in particular, stuff matching up and going through existing housing infrastructures would be ideal, so it's not sort of bifurcated, so it's easier, there's ease of use for those programs. So starting to think about that at the front end is really important, I think, because we've had a lot of learnings on the ground through a lot of our green financing work that it takes defragmentation and programmatic solutions and not just sort of financial products to really make it work in the right way. And I think we're at the right point in the resilience financing conversation to really start to think about that in the right way instead of just rolling out certain products, which actually might make it a little bit more complicated for these folks to be able to do this stuff in the right way. So let's look at the existing public funding. Let's look at how we can leverage that funding. Let's look at programmatically sort of ensuring that that funding is going through the housing infrastructure in the right way to make it work. And so engaging capital markets and investors as we're thinking about that work and not doing that after the fact, but doing it today. And then, again, catalyzing the market. So really piloting these performance-based approaches and innovative financing advisory really for a lot of the risk financing that we're talking about here. So Tom is going to talk a little bit about a case study about how we're sort of thinking about this and how you kind of quantify it and looking at a real brass tacks way that we've actually been able to sort of get some of this stuff done. And what we hope for the conversation a little bit later with everybody on the phone, we hope to really capture is, how and where are folks sitting within these buckets and how are folks thinking about this so that we can start to learn from each other and sort of collaborate from each other to make sure that we're taking the right approach for the LMI sector. Next slide, Bettina. Okay. So Lori, if you want to talk about this a little.
And this is essentially what we were trying to think about in terms of how do you substantiate the investment in resilience improvements.
Yep.
There's savings that can be achieved in the utility space, and this can help with your repayment, especially if you're looking at a PACE type structure. You're looking at more efficiency in operations and asset management, which means potentially reduced staff time and savings in the business asset management space, which, again, if you're an investor, is helpful when you're thinking about your investment. There's potential, real potential for insurance premium reduction if resiliency improvements are incorporated into the facility. And at a community level, if a community incorporates resilience writ large, there's a reduction in their insurance that they'll get through the NFIP program. And then finally, what are some of the benefits that you'll be able to bring in with the improvement made into the facility? And again, one of our next pushes is to try to validate and value those co-benefits so we can have a real number that says with an investment of $1, you can yield $12, $13, $14 in improvements. And here's where you can find some of our tools, and please feel free to reach out to us afterwards for any additional tools.
Great. Thanks, Lori, Esther, and Bettina. This is Tom Chase from New Ecology. I'm going to quickly run through a real on-the-ground example from a project we've done in partnership with Enterprise and with National Housing Trust in Washington, D.C. to create a tool to assess resilience, energy and water savings opportunity, and solar and storage opportunity, conduct on-site assessments and interviews, and then provide recommended scope, estimated costs, and potential funding and financing sources for resilience investments at low and moderate income properties in the district. So this is a real on-the-ground example of what is resilience and how do we pay for it, and one way we think we've worked it out. This is a 202-unit scattered site, low-rise 2- and 3-story masonry development spread out over about 2 miles in southeast Washington, D.C. Built in 1963, moderately rehabbed in 2000, but in pretty rough shape as of today, and a recent acquisition by National Housing Trust. Next slide, please. So some conditions we have on site. It's a very hilly site with a lot of stormwater mitigation issues. So a lot of washout on site from stormwater, a lot of backup into basements from stormwater and sewer pipes exiting buildings. What you see in the upper right and the lower left-hand corners is actually existing electrical equipment and abandoned mechanical equipment that's been impacted by repeated stormwater infiltration into the basement. We see some failed sump pump systems and some pretty severe deterioration of foundation and structure from repeated stormwater sites repeated stormwater infiltration that we only expect to get worse as severe storms increase in magnitude. Next slide. There's also significant energy and water savings opportunity here. We have a lot of outdated equipment. We have a lot of air sealing and insulation that needs to be done. We have roofs that can be converted to cool roofs with insulation and changing black roofs to white roofs to mitigate heat island effect. So lots of fundamental energy and water conservation opportunity as well. Next slide. One of the strategies we looked at for this building comes directly from the Enterprise Resilience Strategies Manual, and that's component protection floodproofing. This is extremely useful in situations where you have mechanical equipment that you can't elevate for structural reasons, or you can't move, or maybe you just don't have the scope to move or replace. And so we have equipment at these sites that can be protected in place with low walls, where we don't have complete inundation of the site by, say, coastal storm surge, but we do have repeated nuisance flooding from stormwater. We can do a level of protection with some fairly small improvements like these. Next slide. Another improvement that's a relatively low cost and big impact is to install backwater valves on the sewer and the stormwater lines leaving the building. So this is a way just to make sure that water leaving the building doesn't come back in when there's a backup due to insufficient stormwater or sewer infrastructure in the neighborhood. Next slide. And part of our scope on all of the assessments we did in DC, and this one in particular, is to try and identify co-benefits for all the improvements we recommend. So a lot of the a lot of the improvements we recommended on this site related to energy and water efficiency, things like air sealing and insulation, will reduce the operating costs both for the owners on their central meters and for the tenants on their bills. But it'll also improve the passive resilience of the building. It'll help the building coast through potential power outages. Say it's a power outage during an extreme heat event or a power outage during a severe winter storm. We also try to avoid measures without co-benefits where possible, or minimize those measures. So a good example of that is a generator. It's an upfront cost, it's an ongoing maintenance cost, and while it does provide a resilience benefit, it doesn't provide other benefits to the day-to-day operations of the building. Next, thanks. This is a measure we looked at for all of the sites, again in DC, and we look at in other places across the country, solar PV plus storage. National Housing Trust is an experienced solar developer, and so we expect them to develop solar PV arrays on the buildings in this development. We're also interested in looking at the opportunity to back up those arrays with small batteries in each building, which will provide a measure of backup power, potentially for lighting or communications during an extreme event, especially in places where there are benefits paid by the utility to integrate batteries into solar systems. We see this as potentially cost neutral or actual cash flow benefit to the property when including batteries. So that's another co-benefit opportunity we had here. Next slide, please. So this is a list of the highlight recommended resilience measures we made at the site. This is meant to kind of demystify the level of investment for coming out of our recommendations for resilience. I will say that as this is a recent acquisition, there are two scopes that are ongoing in terms of the redevelopment of the site. The first is emergency capital repairs being conducted largely out of operating reserves. So things like elevating the electrical equipment, remediating mold, and repairing and replacing sump pumps are all being included in the emergency repairs this year. We also selected this site primarily because of the timing, because it's a recent acquisition. There's a current scope in development now for low-income housing tax credit redevelopment, and we're able to incorporate the remainder of the items on the list, with the exception of building floodproofing, within that scope for redevelopment. So they're low-cost items or items that, because they're part of the low-income housing tax credit redevelopment financing package, are no additional cost. There's no additional cost to the resilience measures for doing them because they're part of the redevelopment and they're paid out of that stream. So that was the real opportunity here and why we wanted to highlight this project today.
All right. Wow. Thank you so much, Esther, Lori, and Tom, for really kicking us off. And now we don't have any questions, which I think is just as well, because we do, I see at least have at least one hand. So as a reminder, feel free to insert questions into the question box or raise your hand, which you should see on the left side of your GoToWebinar control panel. And how appropriate, let's see here. Well, I was going to say how appropriate that someone from the National Housing Trust had his hand raised, but I see that it's not raised. I don't want to call that person out if they don't want to have it raised.
Bettina, I have a question for folks. If just to kick us off,
Yeah.
What are there any attendees specifically looking at structuring a financial tool or some kind of financial product to support resilience improvements?
And do folks know how to unmute themselves, Bettina? Make sure.
Yes, so I'm going to talk Stuart through it right now. Speaking of appropriate people, I see that Stuart from 100 Resilient Communities, or Resilient Cities, sorry, has raised his hand. So Stuart, I'm going to unmute you. Did that work? Click to unmute. All right, I have unmuted you, Stuart.
There
so
we
if
go.
you, yeah, there you go. All right,
worked.
hey, why
Thanks,
don't you
Jen.
just
Hi.
introduce yourself?
All right. I'm Stuart Sarkozy-Bonasi, and I am a senior advisor at 100 Resilient Cities working in the resilience finance team, which is relatively new in its formation, although, of course, because of the work that's been going on with the strategies in cities around the globe, and many in the United States, there's been an element of this all along. So I'm not sure who asked that question.
Lori, yeah.
Hey, Stuart, it's Lori.
Hey, Lori. Oh, okay. Well, then you partially know this answer. So there's a couple of things happening. One, we've got a new resilient community development finance campaign that we're working on. Bettina knows about, Lori knows about, and the elements of that include looking at a screen filter. We're hearing tons of feedback about funds for resilience finance, and so one of the things that's happening. There's a large-scale fund being developed, and a manager for that is going to be announced. It's a big. It's called the TURF, the Urban Resilience Fund, and that will relate to all types of large infrastructure projects. What's more important for this conversation, for what I'm doing, is looking at a variety of tools and connecting projects to funders, including some of those that are on the phone, that are on the webinar, from project to finance, but also looking at what are the filters and screens and reinforcement that a fund would need in order to do that, because that's one of the things that's happening with the large fund as well, is a resilience screen that goes with it. And I hate to tell you, but it's called the TURF and the SURF. So the screen, the SURF for the TURF is being done in parallel, and then I'm taking that and looking at it. And for the Resilient Community Development Finance campaign, how does that work for impact investors, CDFIs, PRA makers, others in the United States? And of course, to some extent, the focus is education and awareness for those that particularly fit our cities, but it is a broader conversation as well. So there's a couple of things underway that fit in terms of response to Laura's question.
Great.
Yeah, I think that, yeah, we could talk a lot more about that. I think in the interest of time, let's get a couple other people just sharing, and then maybe respond to what folks are doing in this space. I think next we'll go to Carrie O'Neill. Carrie, I see that you weren't quite sure if your audio will work, but let's give it a try. Carrie's with the Inclusive Prosperity Capital, a new spin out of Connecticut Green Bank. Are you there, Carrie?
I am, Bettina. Can you hear me?
Yep, there you are.
Oh, great. Yeah, I just, to the question of, who out there is developing products or financing around resiliency, we are definitely interested in that space, Inclusive Prosperity Capital. We don't have a product per se around it. We have products for multifamily, but are more than happy to look at projects that include resiliency. And if we feel like a specialized product needs to be developed around resiliency, we'll go ahead and do that. But love the space, and definitely interested in seeing projects happen there, particularly around low to moderate income affordable housing.
Awesome. Thank you, Carrie. And I'm seeing a question from Melissa Malkin-Weber from Self Help. And Melissa, I'm not sure if you would want to voice your question vocally. I'm going to go ahead and unmute you in case you're interested in doing that. I think I can hear you in case you'd like to speak.
Bettina, are you able to hear me?
Yes, there you are. Go ahead, Melissa.
Yeah. Magic of technology. So my question is more of a comment and asking for discussion or any workarounds, and that is because the Self-Help's particular circumstance as a CDFI is we tend to get individual projects coming in from our pipeline, and we're evaluating each project loan by loan. So by the time we're evaluating a loan, or even in serious conversation with a building owner or a nonprofit, they've got a pretty baked pro forma. They're pretty clear on what their sources are going to be. They may have already paid their architect, certainly enrolled a general contractor. So like they already know what they want to do. And at that point, all of the terrific things that look so compelling that we've seen in this webinar are almost, the ship's already sailed. We can't do anything about that unless we could somehow tap into, the infinite subsidy. So I'm wondering if y'all could talk about how do you get into a project early enough to be able to influence it, or are there a menu of things you can do around the margins when you get to a project late stage?
That's a great question, and that's one of the ways we've been trying to tee up some of this work with affordable housing is developing tools to support the incorporation of resilience into the capital planning at the outset. So we developed a couple tools. We worked closely with New Ecology over the years, and we've developed a tool called the Resiliency Capital Needs Assessment, which is a tool that can be basically taken by a smart professional at a building to run through the identification of vulnerabilities and provide some recommended solutions for resilience. And this tool can be deployed, and then you can understand what your potential pathways would be to incorporate the resilience improvements into your capital planning when there's an opportunity to do a light mod rehab or even a substantial rehab. So one of the things that we advise owners is to really have those conversations internally and early on with your engineering and design teams to say, this is an important aspect of our work. We really want to make sure we're mitigating risk. And so we want you to start folding into all of the planning work you do this lens of resilience. But a lot of resilience work can happen at the operations level as well, and at the level of, just merely setting up an emergency plan. So there's some light touch stuff that can be done while you're waiting for that bigger moment to occur. And even in operations and maintenance, there's interventions you can make that can save you money, build your resilience, and it's not going to cost a lot of money. And we can certainly have a deeper conversation about that.
Thanks, Lori. This is Tom. I would add quickly two additional thoughts on that. We're starting to incorporate resilience assessments with more routine ASHRAE Level 2 audits for energy efficiency opportunities. So where a project will go through an audit prior to developing their rehab scope, we can try to tap into that process to engage on resilience there as well. And then part of the phase 2 of the work that we're doing with the DC pilot project is to think about how to integrate resilience opportunity assessments into the funding and financing streams that exist already, so that the assessment or conducting the assessment is part of the gate before you're allowed to apply for funding.
Yeah. Because it seems like a lot of the resiliency space is sort of, I think a lot of folks were trying to solve for this in sort of the green days or energy efficiency days, where you have folks like Fannie Mae that now have high performance building modules that are starting to think about things like resilience more. And, and it's interesting because when you start to look at those measures, a lot of the measures around mitigation, some of them are energy, some of them are renewable energy, like Tom highlighted, like what National Housing Trust is doing to a lot of their own portfolio. And you can incorporate things like storage for that or reduce energy load. So some of that stuff does exist within the framework and the scope. And I think resiliency measures are also sort of expanding what that scope is. Like a lot of folks are looking at health and some of the other co-benefits. So there are sort of green capital needs assessments that are out there, but how do you start to kind of look at integrating the resilience aspects of those projects up front as well, and making sure that that's not left off the table, so you can include it in your overall capital planning. And so for projects that are already sort of fully baked, I think what Lori is saying, looking at the operations and maintenance and looking at some of the tools that we've developed are a really good opportunity to start to kind of think about that for existing buildings where the financing has already been sort of set in place.
But, I'll just add, there's nothing like a regulatory compliance moment, tool to help drive action. And so when we see in Los Angeles, Mayor Garcetti's put out a mandate that owners need to comply with seismic mitigation or they face fines and infractions, I mean, that's a helpful instrument. So I would ask those of you looking at resiliency financing, I mean, are there regulatory instruments that you can leverage to help encourage the adoption of this work, whether it's through code, whether it's through just a straight regulatory enforcement?
Great. And we do have one clarifying question this is Bettina again, from Ben Cooper of Stop Waste out in California. He's wondering if y'all can provide an example of O&M that would improve a building's resilience.
That's great. Well, I'm going to turn to Tom, but I will say one of the lowest rung items is thinking about sealing up your buildings, caulking your holes, sealing up anything that would allow in water or humidity. That's a really important move and something that we encourage everyone to look at very closely.
And that also leads to health, right, improvements where you're reducing mold. So there's a co-benefit there too. It's a pretty low cost co-benefit.
Sure, I would say that the good operations and maintenance around central mechanical equipment and electrical systems really does improve resilience. One of the things we saw, certainly in my experience during Hurricane Sandy, is that buildings that were able to shut down in advance of an extreme event and get back online after the event more quickly had better day-to-day operations and maintenance to begin with. So having your owner manuals, having equipment that's in good condition and well maintained is a great resilience measure as well. As is emergency staffing planning, just knowing who's responsible for what, where they're going to be, how to get in touch with them, how to get important information to and from residents. That's all very low cost operations and maintenance planning that really does improve the resilience of a building during an extreme event.
Thanks, Tom. All right, and then I think just one last question I think is really interesting before maybe we go over 1 minute talking about next steps. The question is, what's the sense of the problem among different housing agencies? Are they on board with solving this, this being the issue of resilience? And the question's from James Gepner from Erase 40.
It depends on the constituency and the risks getting that are confronting the particular jurisdiction. So we find in Puerto Rico, the housing department, Vivienda, is incredibly integral to the recovery effort of the island, and they're going to be incorporating resiliency investments into all of the work they do going forward. Houston as well. New York City has a strong capacity around this area as well. So, you have to figure out how to present the cost benefit of this work. And one of the tools we need to start thinking about as an industry is how do we substantiate this investment for the regulators, for the agencies, for cities, to say it's worth figuring out what kind of ways you can innovate your financing and stand up programs, because the impact and the cost to you for not doing that is significant.
Yeah, and again, just to say, I know we're 1 minute over, but housing finance agencies, again, from our perspective, they're 100% imperative to sort of making this work, right? And we have so many folks and great relationships that really want to. And I think what we've learned a lot from the green work in general over many, many years, again, I'll reiterate what I said, a lot of the time it's not sort of just a financing silver bullet solution, but it is collaborating to sort of ensure that the folks that we work with on the ground, that they're working with their business as usual process around real estate development, around real estate finance. And that comes from the housing finance agencies. So when you have a lot of this public funding coming in, sort of ensuring that it's not fragmented is making sure that there's interagency collaboration and making sure that we're coming up with solutions at the front end that don't further fragment the existing funding that's kind of coming through on the public side. How do you leverage those dollars, and how do we sort of leverage collaboration together to really make it work? So that's something that we're really committed to doing in this space, and we're working with really friendly housing finance agencies, frankly, that want to get this stuff done.
And on the topic of housing finance agencies, we just entered into a partnership on a project with the Delaware State Housing Authority, which is also the housing finance agency there, to do a risk and vulnerability assessment for the entire statewide public housing portfolio. So they clearly heard the call and are starting to take action, and we're starting to see that amongst housers, certainly at the larger scale, the ones that have more capacity to begin with, and we're hoping that knowledge and the institutional concern moves to a broader group.
All right. Well, I want to thank. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Or did you? Okay. We are a little bit over time, but thanks, Tom, for those last words. And want to just thank Lori and Esther and Tom so much for leading us through this call. Want to say thanks to Stuart and Carrie, Ben and James for all contributing. And I know there is a lot more to say on this. We're all committed to forwarding this cause of resilience and affordable housing. So I know that those of us who were leading the call have talked about potentially getting a working group together to continue this conversation and to continue creating resources that we can all use. So I think I will follow up with everybody on that. I will be circulating the enterprise strategies document that Lori mentioned. I'm seeing a couple yes to the working group comments come in, so that's really great to hear. And yeah, exactly. So Lori and Esther, I'll follow up with you guys on that. And thanks again to everyone for joining the call. Look out for more opportunities to engage in this. And have a great day. Yeah, thanks, Tom, Lori, Esther. Talk to you soon.
Awesome.
Thanks,
Thank
Bettina.
you.
Great job.
Thanks all.
Bye. Thanks.
Great job.